Coming up on the Sky News Daily with me, Niall Paterson, divisions in reform. A bitter falling out between Nigel Farage and another of his 4 MPs has spilled into the open. So is the party over for reform?
The world is becoming increasingly complex and volatile. How can we make sense of it all?
I'm Richard Engel.
And I'm Yelda Hakim.
And we present Sky News' latest podcast, The World. Each week, we'll cut through the noise to guide you through the week's global events and explain to you why what happens out there matters to you wherever you are.
We're on the ground in some of the world's toughest places. Listen now to The World with Richard Engel and me, Yelda Hakim, wherever you get your podcasts.
Nigel Farage, a man who divides opinion as often as he pops down the pub. But what's undeniable is that he has changed the shape of British politics. There is, of course, the Brexit referendum, but his Reform Party came from nowhere to 14% of the vote at the general election. Now, admittedly, that did only turn into 5 MPs, of which he is one. But polling suggests Reform is nipping at the heels of the Conservatives and Labour. So with local elections and a by-election pending, the last thing the party wants is an almighty row. But that's what they've got, with Nigel Farage suspending fellow MP Rupert Lowe from the party. Here to explain, our chief political correspondent, John Craig. John, just tell me exactly what has been going on with Rupert Lowe and Nigel Farage.
It's a clash of egos, essentially. Some will claim it's about the direction of the party, but it's all about Nigel Farage not appreciating dissent and stamping down on it. The falling out between Rupert Lowe and Nigel Farage can be traced back to January, really, when a certain Elon Musk criticised Mr Farage and said he wasn't sure he had what it takes. And he said, I haven't met Rupert Lowe, but I like the sound of what he has to say. And I think from that day, Mr Lowe's card was marked and the assassins were sent out to shoot him down.
But the row between the two certainly deepened more recently than that, didn't it, John, when an article appeared in the Daily Mail?
Mr Lowe pulled no punches, really, and he really gave it to Nigel Farage with both barrels in a way that, I suppose, in any political party, if a leading MP had done that, they'd be in deep trouble with the leadership. For example, it's too early to know whether Nigel will deliver the goods, said Mr Lowe. He's got messianic qualities. Will these messianic qualities distill into sage leadership? I don't know. He said we have to change from being a protest party led by the Messiah, that's Mr Farage, into being a properly structured party with a front bench. Now, that was a rather odd comment. A party with 4 or 5 MPs, 5 previously, now 4, having a front bench, well, that's a ridiculous statement, really. But he went on to say that Nigel is a messianic figure and he has to learn to delegate. So that did not go down well, as you can imagine, and the response was brutal. It was brutal because he was suspended, had the whip taken away from him, and suddenly we learned about all sorts of charges against him.
It's all incredibly unedifying for a party that wishes to move to the mainstream of British politics. But
well, you've hit the nail on the head there when you talk about move to the mainstream.
Go on, John.
One theory, of course, is that that's what Mr Farage wants to do and Mr Lowe doesn't. Mr Farage wants to, as a columnist in the Times, Danny Finkelstein, put it this week, Mr Farage wants to broaden support, whereas Mr Lowe wants to deepen support. In other words, Mr Farage, obviously chasing Tory votes, wants to make the party perhaps a bit more like the Tories. He's distanced himself from controversial figures like Tommy Robinson, where Mr Lowe hasn't. And Mr Lowe's taken a very hard-line stance on deporting illegal migrants and so on, which Mr Farage has distanced himself from. So as well as a clash of egos, there is a bit of a clash of ideology and strategy too.
So bring us up to date with the latest. Rupert Lowe and Nigel Farage, never BFFs, but Rupert Lowe has reached out to him.
Well, he's reached out more than once, but the latest, Neil, well, honestly, he's written a letter to Mr Farage It reads like a communication from perhaps a spurned wife as a couple who are about to get divorced. And she's pleading, let's not get divorced, let's stick together, let's patch things up for the sake of the children. Although Mr. Lowe's saying for the members. He says, my latest invitation for dinner with you did not receive a response. I'm going to make one last effort. Our members deserve that. We must resolve this in the manner expected of us by both the party and the country. In private, behind closed doors, just the two of us. He ends by saying, I once considered you a friend. I no longer do. There remains a better way to resolve this. No response, by the way, from Mr. Farage.
I mean, doesn't he have a point? You can challenge the use of the language, Messiah and all the rest of it, but this is a party that is centred very firmly around one man. That man being, of course, Farage.
So you can argue, and I would agree with this, that Farage is a brilliant campaigner. And you could argue perhaps his qualities are messianic. He's great on the stump. He's a great broadcaster. And he really revived the Reform UK campaign. And they polled 4.1 million votes. There's no doubt that Mr. Farage made a difference. But the criticism is he's a one-man band. Having said that, since the general election, the two MPs, I would say, who've made the most impact in Parliament don't include Mr. Farage. They are Rupert Lowe and, secondly, Richard Tice. They are the more regular attenders. They're the ones making speeches, and they're the ones that have got themselves noticed in the House of Commons.
But look, that general election victory, and it was a big victory for Reform, 14% of the vote went their way. They're now polling in the low 20s. The timing of this row couldn't be worse for them.
Well, some of the polls have, in the last, 2, 3, 4 weeks, have had Reform UK edging ahead of the Labour Party. One or two have got Labour back in front slightly. Yes, they were riding high. Having said that, Mr. Farage has taken a bit of a knock from what Keir Starmer says, his fawning over President Putin. And of course, the last few weeks, the news has been dominated by Donald Trump's intervention in Ukraine, controversially, his bust up with President Zelensky in the White House. And Mr. Farage has been accused by political opponents of, as the PM puts it, fawning over President Putin. That's damaged his personal ratings in the polls. And as for this, I'm not convinced at the moment this is going to damage them too much because, of course, there was a poll this week which suggested that 86% of voters didn't have a clue who Rupert Lowe is, and something like 71% of Reform voters didn't know who he was.
But isn't it also that actually, people do have long political memories, and frankly, Nigel Farage has fond for this. Take a wander back through his political career, and you start to see the bodies begin to pile up.
And there is a long list, Neil, absolutely, of people who Mr. Farage has fallen out with and are now absolutely nowhere in UK politics or even in Reform UK. Courtesy of the Daily Telegraph, which very kindly and helpfully listed them, I can tell you who they are. Rupert Lowe, the Telegraph wrote, joins a long line of high-profile Faragean fallings out. Farage versus Alan Sked. I mean, that's going back a long time.
Don't even remember him.
Robert Kilroy Silk.
Remember him.
Jeffrey Bloom. Suzanne Evans. Douglas Carswell. Ben Habib. Now, Ben Habib is an interesting one. He was deputy leader and he's now very much aligned himself to Rupert Lowe and says Mr. Lowe should become the leader. But Mr. Farage clearly is intolerant of dissent, it looks like, anyway.
Yeah, he may well rule with an iron fist, but he is ruling a party that is polling ever higher, that is increasing its membership, that is reaching parts that both the Labour and Conservative parties cannot.
It's a crucial time for Reform because, of course, there are important elections coming up. Now, Mr. Farage has been talking about his party doing well in Wales. He's been talking about taking lots of councils from possibly Labour and the Conservatives. And, of course, there's a key by-election coming up. Now, this is Runcorn and Helsby, which is a Merseyside seat previously held by Mike Amesbury. He's the Labour MP who rather brutally assaulted a voter, pleaded guilty to assault, and eventually he was facing a recall petition, eventually has quit. We expect that by-election probably on the 1st of May, the day of the local elections, but Reform were second there at the general election. about a 14,000 majority for Mr Amesbury, but Reform were 1,000 or so ahead of the Tories. They would hope to make a real impact here.
I mean, John, as you said, you've been up close and personal with Nigel Farage many a time. I mean, is he just particularly thin-skinned? He's never come across that way to me.
I personally think that Nigel Farage and his team, and when I say and his team, I think possibly the chairman, Zia Youssef, have overreacted to this. Now, whether they wanted this sort of row with Rupert Lowe, I'm not sure. But it's not doing them any good. And the longer it drags on, and Mr Lowe seems in no mood to back down, despite his letter saying, please, let's kiss and make up, Nigel.
This is a party that's gone from 5 to 4 MPs. I mean, if he can't manage a party where he can count his colleagues on the fingers of one hand, what chance does he ever have of getting to Downing Street as he says he's going to?
Obviously, it's a long way from the next general election. Mr Farage obviously wants to build, get more councillors, select better candidates. He talks about professionalising the party. It's a long way to go. And you're right, 5 MPs down to 4. To lose one of your MPs is, unfortunate. To lose 20% of your party is pretty careless. Perhaps Mr Farage thinks it makes him look tough to attack Mr Lowe. But Mr Lowe does appear to have a certain amount of grassroots support, and he's got vocal support from Ben Habib. We put some questions to Mr Lowe earlier this week. We asked him, for example, would you be interested in joining Ben Habib, who's talked about forming a new party with Mr Lowe and said they've been in touch, or the alternative, perhaps joining the Tories. Chris Philp, the Shadow Home Secretary, said at the weekend, we welcome anyone who wants to come and join the Tory party. Well, obviously they do at the moment. And Mr Lowe said in response to those, well, I'm keeping all my options open. I mean, it'd be a massive coup if he went and joined the Tories. A breakaway Reform UK with Mr Habib? I don't know. Breakaway parties, which I suppose Reform UK was at one stage, take a while to get established. But I think this is damaging for Reform. It's more than a storm in a teacup, and I don't quite see how it's going to be resolved at the moment because Mr Farage seems in no mood to compromise, and the door seems fairly slammed in Mr Lowe's face.
Thanks, John. So, what of those within the party? Let's speak to Gawain Towler, a long-time Nigel Farage backer. He had been Director of Communications at Reform UK until he lost his job in the party's reorganisation, but he does remain a member and campaigner. Gawain, look, we've just been speaking to John Craig, and as he points out, this isn't the first time that Nigel Farage has had to put down insurrection in the ranks. So, simple question, might it be Nigel Farage that's actually the problem?
It's very odd, don't you think, that you have an insurrection at a time. Normally, insurrections take place when the leadership is weak, where things are failing, everything's going wrong. You normally don't have an insurrection when the membership's gone from 35,000 to 220,000. You don't normally have an insurrection when you're starting to win council by-elections up and down the country. It seems to be a very quixotic time to launch an insurrection if that's what's going on.
So what is going on?
I think that there's a difference of character and a difference in patience. I don't think many people realise how hard it is to create a political party, run a political party, have that structure, create the business end. There's so much work going on since the election. And I think there is a frustration amongst those people who are used in their lives to click their fingers and things happen, to being part of a broader team, sometimes biting your lip in order for the greater cause to succeed.
But isn't what's happening right now with Reform just a natural consequence of moving from outsider status to the mainstream of politics?
It is entirely a natural consequence. Mistakes will be made. Nobody is perfect. Even the Messiah will make mistakes. I use the metaphor. We've gone from a corner shop to Morrison's in the period of 6 months. It is a phenomenal success so far, but sometimes people in that situation will feel ignored, will feel sidelined as the machine moves forward.
I know that you said this with tongue-in-cheek and eyebrow firmly arched, but is Nigel Farage truly the Messiah, or is he
of course he's not.
Or isn't he more akin to a bit of a naughty boy? I mean, isn't it just a consequence of his personality that compels him to oust personal rivals as he has done in the past?
It's a consequence of his personality that we are challenging the other parties. It's a consequence of his personality that at times in the last month or two we've been leading in the polls. So there are downsides to his personality, but the point is there are also massive upsides. And in the last 30 years, I don't think there's been a more effective or consequential politician than Farage. despite his faults.
Is this all because Rupert Lowe has been showing Elon Musk just a little bit of ankle? You don't think so?
No. Nigel has his own support base. He has his own fans and all the rest of it. I don't think he gives two hoots about that.
You're not telling me that Nigel Farage does not see Rupert Lowe as a challenge to his leadership?
OK. Take a photograph of me, take a photograph of Rupert, take a photograph of Nigel, take a photograph of you. Take these 4 photographs to a council estate outside Preston, a council estate outside Boston, and show them those photographs. Who do they know?
Yeah, well, of course it's going to be Nigel Farage.
So why would he be jealous?
Because at the moment, in a party where he is something, not a messianic figure necessarily, but he is certainly a figurehead, there's almost a quarter of party members that don't look upon him favourably. That's the latest YouGov polling. 23% of Reform members don't look at Nigel Farage favourably. That's why I suggest it may well be a challenge to his leadership.
Do they have those figures for Kemi?
For Kemi Badenoch, they do, but I imagine, not true, you're absolutely right. There's
come on,
discontent.
this is silly. 50% of that poll of Reform members don't even know the name Rupert Lowe. Look, all party leaders will have people within the party that don't like them.
Yeah.
That's normal.
Yeah, but what is the cost if this doesn't get put to bed sometime soon?
I think, essentially, given what's happened over the last 24 hours, it is in bed, the blankets are being tucked in, it's all over by the shouting. Now, we've got these 2 investigations that will no doubt come out, but I think some of the behaviours in the last week have made it impossible, no matter how the investigations come out, for things to be improved. It
is past that point. Yeah, there is no rapprochement between
Nigel said so yesterday, so we are where we are. It's not where I'd like to be, but we are where we are. And if we pick up in the council elections in May, if we, against the wind, nick in Runcorn, all this will be completely forgotten. The momentum will continue.
Thanks, Gawain. And for more on reforms in fighting, head over to the Electoral Dysfunction podcast. That's available from Friday morning. Beth Rigby, Ruth Davidson and Harriet Harman have been speaking to Andrea Jenkins. She's the former Conservative MP turned Reform candidate in the election to be Greater Lincolnshire's mayor. To find out which side she's backing in the Reform round, just have a look on your podcast app. But that's your lot for this edition of The Daily. We are back again tomorrow.
Donald Trump is heading back to the White House.
Together we can truly make America great again.
We are in for an unpredictable but fascinating 4 years.
And we're going to be following every twist and turn for the first 100 days. We'll be bringing you the latest updates and analysis first thing every morning. So join me, James Matthews.
Me, Martha Kellner.
And me, Mark Stone.
For Trump 100, every weekday at 6 a.m, wherever you get your podcasts.